Good evening. Thanks for joining us to explore what is Zionism, followed next week with the sequel, what is anti-Zionism, because sometimes you define the statue by what it is, and sometimes you define the statue by everything you've taken off around it. So we'll have a chance to explore both sides of that question in the next 2 weeks. If we don't talk about something today, we'll probably get to it next week. Zionism begins with a place. It's not a political ideology independent of the place. And the place is Mount Zion. It's a hill, you might say, that's part of Jerusalem. And Zionism as a political ideology would have never existed if the Judeans had stayed in Judea. What happened was in the 6th century BCE, Jerusalem was destroyed, and the leadership of the Judeans was taken into exile. During that exile, they had a deep longing to return to their homeland, so they maintained their Judeanness even outside of Judea. When they had the opportunity to return about 100 years later, some of them went back and some of them decided to stay, creating the first Jewish diaspora, where Jews were living outside of that land that they came from. And eventually, even the ones who had returned to Judea had to leave because about 500 years later, there was a revolt against the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire destroyed Jerusalem again. And thus, you had a wider diaspora of Jews all across the Greco-Roman world and into the Eastern diaspora, into the Parthian Empire and other lands further afield. This is really the transition from Judean to Jew. When you were no longer living in Judea or had roots in Judea immediately, you had ancient roots in Judea, but your current roots were where you were. You were the proverbial wandering Jew. And throughout Jewish history, there was still this desire to return to the land, whether or not they actually acted on it. It was certainly a desire that was expressed in many ways. Here are 2 examples. The first is Psalm 137, which appears in the Hebrew Bible, the book of Psalms. It's also recited as part of the weekly Birkat HaMazon, or blessing on meals. That's part of the weekly ritual whenever you're having a major meal. You would recite this text. And you can see that setting in the Babylonian exile when they're remembering Zion, you see in the first verse. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down. Yes, we wept when we remembered Zion. On the willows in that land, we hung our harps. For there those who led us captive asked for songs. Those who tormented us demanded songs of joy. Sing us one of the songs of Zion. You see here again, Zion becomes the stand-in for Judea, Jerusalem, the homeland. And then they ask the key question in verse 4. How can we sing Yahweh's song, our God's song, in a foreign land? If I forget you, Jerusalem, let my right hand forget its skill. Let my tongue stick to the roof of my mouth. If I don't remember you, if I don't prefer Jerusalem above my chief joy. Now, this is a longing for return to the homeland, to the home city. But there is a violent edge to it. Remember Yahweh against the children of Edom in the day of Jerusalem, who said, destroy it to its foundation. Daughter of Babylon, doomed to destruction. He will be happy who rewards you as you have served us. Happy shall he be who takes and dashes your little ones against the rock. There's definitely a sense of revenge, not just restoration. Throughout the centuries, there was an orientation toward this land. Prayers were recited facing Jerusalem. And here's a passage from the 4th cup of wine blessed at the Passover Seder in the Passover Haggadah. Blessed are you, our God, King of the universe, for the wine and the fruit of the vine, the produce of the field, and so on. Notice the underlined part. Have compassion, our God, upon Israel, your people, and upon Jerusalem, your city, and upon Zion, the residence of your glory, and upon your altar and your temple. Rebuild Jerusalem, the holy city, speedily in our days, and bring us back up into it, and let us be joyful in its building, and let us eat of its fruit and enjoy its bounty, and praise you for it in holiness and purity. So here you have a deep expression of a desire to return to this land. but a desire to return to this land in a miraculous, almost messianic way, to have God do the work. And so for centuries, Jews longed to return, but didn't actually return in great numbers. Some did occasionally, some did near the end of life to be buried there, but they didn't go in great numbers until the dawn of the Zionist movement in the 19th century. So we're now going to fast forward from the Passover Haggadah in the Middle Ages to the late 19th century. Waiting for the Messiah to bring them to the land has not worked. They've prayed, they've hoped, they've longed. Sometimes they've believed false messiahs. Nothing has worked on the messianic front. Plus, a number of Jews have become secularized and don't necessarily believe in a messiah anymore anyways. The Enlightenment in Europe has attracted some Jews to become part of broader European culture, in some cases even converting out of Judaism as their passport to being part of this universal Enlightenment culture. Other Jews have stayed Jewish, but changed Jewish life to be more in concert with Enlightenment ideas and modern civilization. Their hope was that they would have a promise fulfilled. With the rise of something called democracy, they could become something new, a citizen, not just a Jewish resident in Europe, but a citizen of their new national political entity. They could be a German citizen of the Mosaic faith. They could be a patriotic Frenchman for whom fraternité, brotherhood, was an important ideal, while still maintaining some kind of Jewish identity. However, by the end of the 19th century, a new phenomenon appeared called anti-Semitism. And this new modern anti-Semitism defined Jewishness as a race, as an ethnic identity, we might say, something you could not leave behind by religious veneers or an otherness that you could not solve. In fact, the rise of ethnic nationalism, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, had raised a challenge for the Jews, because here were the Jews, this people that were seemingly unassimilable, because you try to make them citizens, but they maintain their identity through religion. And you try to persecute their religion, and they stubbornly maintain it without converting to Christianity. There's an author and a scholar named Gil Troy who wrote a relatively recent book called The Zionist Ideas. It's an anthology of a variety of Zionist thinkers, writers, and political positions. It's a really interesting book, and I wanted to read to you a short passage here where he summarizes the basic problem, the Jewish question that needed to be answered, and the basic logic of Zionism to answer that question. And then we'll unpack this a little bit. Europeans had spent more than a century debating the Jewish problem, what to do with this unassimilable and often detested people. Building towards Israel's establishment in 1948, the Zionist movement had to convince the world and most of the Jews who were skeptical of the fundamental Zionist logic. Here it is. The European Enlightenment's attempts to reduce Judaism to just a religion failed. The Jewish people always needed more than a synagogue as communal space. In modern times, Jews' unique national religious fusion earned them collective rights to statehood somewhere. The land of Israel, the ancestral Jewish homeland, was the logical, legitimate, and viable place to relaunch that Jewish national project. Restoring Jewish sovereignty there was a pressing priority to save the long-oppressed Jews and to let them rejuvenate, spawning a proud, strong, idealistic new Jew. So what are the logical steps? The logic begins with the Enlightenment had failed to make Judaism just a religion. Jews still identified ethnically, were still persecuted by who they were as an ethnicity. They were an ethnic nation. They were not simply a religious denomination. The fact that they were then an ethnic nation, like other ethnic nations, they deserve a chance to live out their ethnic culture and to have a sense of sovereignty in their own political entity. This is happening in Polish nationalism, in Czech nationalism, Serbian nationalism. This is happening all over Europe at this time, that push for ethnic self-determination. Where to do that? Well, it doesn't make sense to do it in Poland or Ukraine. Those are ancestral homelands of other peoples. The ancestral homeland of the Jews is this land of Israel. And therefore, restoring a Jewish sovereignty there is very important for two reasons: to save Jews physically, but also to save Jews spiritually, emotionally, content-wise. It would, in fact, change them for the better as individuals and as a collective group. So what you can see from that logic progression is that Zionism has always been complicated because it's not just working for a political state. It's working for a political state where most of the Jews aren't living. It's working for a political state that will affect Jews who never go there. And it's working for an entity and a movement and an idea that will change who the Jews are and change what their Judaism is. It's not simply a political boundaries and an army and a taxation system. It is something more. So Zionism has never just been a political project. It's always been a Jewish identity project as well. Now, there were two sets of goals for Zionism: the physical and the spiritual, you might say. Jewish survival was very important. Physical Jewish survival from persecution was very important in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. Obviously, the lesson of the Holocaust was learned, that we needed a place that would always take in Jews. Zionism was also focused on Jewish survival by pushing for Jewish self-defense, the desire to fight back, not necessarily rely on the kindness of strangers or the goodwill of our host population, but to fight back. Now, Zionists weren't the only Jews that fought back in this time period. There were Jewish socialists as well who were active in Jewish self-defense. But once you have a border, once you have a country, you can have an army. You can have the force to protect yourself from outside invasion or persecution. And perhaps also another element of the Jewish survival was a desire to separate those Jews who had become more secularized from other peoples in a more secularizing world, who might be tempting not by fear, but by love. And so if you put all the secular Jews in a secular Jewish country, then they'll marry with each other and make more Jews versus the possibility of leaving. Now, that's the survival side, the physical side. What's the spiritual side? What does it mean to look for Jewish thriving, not just Jewish survival? Well, we heard that reference to the idea of a new Jew. Zionism said that they would remake the Jews physically. You would have someone who stood up straight instead of being bent like the old Jew. They would be self-assertive instead of passive. They would be fighting back instead of trying to negotiate or accommodate. They would work in productive industries, farming and shepherding, not just living in cities and secondhand trading things and getting in the negotiations of messy business. They would be learning new things, science and innovation, and creating technologies, not just reciting the old texts over and over again. And by and large, the new Jew was thought to be secular, focused on this world, as opposed to religious and focused on the supernatural world, the ancient Jewish past or a messianic Jewish future. Let's focus on here and now. That's the new Jew. The old line was to build the land, livnot et haaretz v'lehibanot ba, to build the land and to be built by the fact that we're doing the building. Now, what you can also hear out of that is a desire for Jewish dignity, a sense of strength that we can stand up for ourselves and live our own life and determine our own fate. It's that strength of self-determination. And even if there are diaspora Jews who never come to this land, they will gain that strength of self-determination by seeing the example of what's happening in this new state. There's also a desire to facilitate Jewish thriving for rootedness. You may have heard occasionally the accusation that Jews are rootless cosmopolitans. They're not rooted in the land anywhere. They're simply citizens of the world, and they have no loyalty to any place because they're from nowhere and everywhere. But the land of Israel is where Jews can say, I'm from here. I had the experience when I led a trip there in 2019, where we visited a synagogue that had been buried and excavated in the 1990s, but it had been buried for something like 1,000, 1,200 years after an earthquake. And we had to leave the synagogue a little bit early because they were setting up chairs to have a bar mitzvah ceremony in this ancient synagogue. And it was such an electric moment, even if I didn't get to see the bar mitzvah, to know that they were observing a bar mitzvah in a synagogue that goes back thousands of years with mosaics on the floor and all kinds of beautiful decorations. But that's a kind of rootedness that Jews outside of Israel simply don't have. Certainly the ones who have left Europe after the destruction of European Jewry. I mean, Jews in America, the furthest back we go is 1656. We don't have roots before then, unless you count some of the crypto-Jewish communities in the Southwest. We don't have that kind of rootedness that goes back 1,000 years, 1,500 years. Jews in Israel have that kind of rootedness. That's why archaeology is so important for Israeli culture, as is traveling the land and seeing the landscape. Part of that rootedness would result in something that Jews hadn't experienced for a long time. It's normalization. The concept was a normal people live on their land and have everything that a normal state would have, including criminals and homeless people and drug addicts and everything else. All the negatives, that's part of being a normal people too. Ben-Gurion said it, when we have Jewish criminals, I'll feel like we've arrived and we're finally a normal people. There was also a sense that the Jews were kind of a ghost nation. You know, if you imagine the people are like the soul of the nation and the land is the body, well, the Jews had their nation destroyed, their body was destroyed, but the spirit in the people kept wandering around for centuries, and it scared everybody because here they are, a people that have no land. They have no body to live in. They are a ghost nation. And that's why people push them out, kick them out, oppress them, because they don't know what to do with them. Once you have a Jewish people in a Jewish land that is Jewish, that is a Jewish state, now they can become a normal nation, and that will, the thought was that the founding of Israel would solve anti-Semitism. Well, as we'll see in the anti-Zionist discussion, that did not turn out to be the case. And then finally, Jewish thriving would be produced by what this new Jewish state could produce. If you had a territory that was defined by Jewish identity, that ran on a Jewish calendar, used Jewish language, you could create wonderful, interesting, creative, new Jewish culture. There's an old idea that the Jews were a light unto the nations, but this idea, as expressed by the cultural Zionist Achad Ha'am, would be as if the Jews living in Israel would be a light unto the Jews who are living among the nations. Their music, their art, their creativity, that would have a sort of knockoff effect or a dispersion effect to the Jews all over the world, even if they never moved to Israel proper. Now, Zionism today is often used as an epithet. It's a negative, it's an automatic, terrible thing, and it's the worst possible example of it. But there are actually varieties of Zionism, many varieties of Zionism, in fact. We'll take a look at 6 of them. This is the breakdown that Gil Troy uses in his Zionist Ideas. It makes sense to me to follow it as a way of breaking down the different styles of Zionistic thought. So the first style of Zionism was what was called political Zionism. Political Zionism was what was founded with the World Zionist Congress in 1897. If you think of Theodor Herzl, his book, The Jewish State, that's an expression of this political Zionist idea. The goal was, for the political Zionists, creating a political entity. And political Zionists felt the best way to do that would be to make alliances with great powers who could then grant them the right to create this state, rather than being able to advocate for it in some kind of international body, which didn't exist before the end of World War I. And even then, the League of Nations was not particularly effective. Their goal was to push for some kind of international grant, and they finally got it in 1917 with what was called the Balfour Declaration, where the British government, under Lord Balfour, who was the Foreign Secretary, issued the following statement you'll see on your screen. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. So they're trying to address two concerns here. One is what will happen to the non-Jews who are in this national home for the Jewish people, and what will happen to the Jews who don't go to that national home for the Jewish people. Will they be thought to be dually loyal or otherwise suspect, or undermine their citizenship and status that they already have in the United Kingdom, in France, and so on? If you wanted to try to find an example of political Zionism today, it's a little bit hard because, after all, the state was established. Like the major initial goal was there. But you might consider the bureaucracy, the governing apparatus of the state, to be the modern expression of political Zionism. It's the politics of the state of Israel. And in fact, many of the parties that you have in the Knesset and the parliament today were parties in the early World Zionist Congresses. So the Labor Party, the what is today the Likud Party, formerly was the Revisionist Party, varieties of religious Zionism, those all existed back in the early days of the World Zionist Congress and simply survived into modern Israeli politics. So that's style one, is political Zionism. Style two is labor Zionism. This was the dominant approach until the 1970s, one might even say, of Israeli political ideology. And the concept was that, sort of like the new Jew idea, that you wanted to bring the Jews to the land. You wanted to not wait for this political promise that may or may not come. You're just going to go and do it. And you're going to do it with Jewish labor on Jewish land. They did not want to hire Arab labor. They wanted Jews to work the land themselves. They worked with the World Zionist Congress to purchase land through the Jewish Agency, but then they set up this collective farm because they were not just laborers, but they were socialists. They wanted this kind of collectivist identity. So you think about the kibbutz, which is started in the 1920s. That's the sort of the flagship of labor Zionism. They were also largely secular. Remember, socialism was convinced that religion was the opiate of the masses. But they were creative because they knew that if they were moving to this land, they couldn't say in their Passover Haggadot, next year in Jerusalem. They could go to Jerusalem next week. They could go next day because it's right, a drive away once you have a car. So the labor Zionist movement had this pro-labor ideology, but also a pro-Jewish ideology in terms of a creative Judaism. So here's an example of a poem by Avraham Shlonsky called Toil. You can hear the labor in it. That is a wonderful expression of this labor Zionist ideology. Dress me, good mother, in a splendorous coat of many colors, and with dawn lead me to toil. My land wraps in light like a prayer shawl, a talit. Houses stand like tefillin, like phylacteries, and like bands of phylacteries guide hand-laid asphalt roads. Thus, a beautiful city offers her morning prayer to her creator. And among the creators, your son, Abraham, poet road builder in Israel. And toward evening at dusk, a father returns from his labors and like prayer whispers with pleasure, a dear son of mine is Abraham, skin, sinew, and bones, hallelujah. Dress me, good mother, in a splendorous coat of many colors, and with dawn lead me to toil. Amal. So what you see in this poem is reclaiming of so many biblical and religious symbols, the coat of many colors from Joseph, right? But not to be praised or to be elevated in some way, but to go out to work and to do the holy work. The land itself is like the body of the Jew. The sun is the prayer shawl. The houses that people have built are like the tefillin, the prayer boxes, and the straps are the roads. The city prays to the creator, but who's the creator? Not God. The creator is Abraham, not the biblical Abraham. This Abraham, who is a poet road builder. I love that imagery. The Paitan Solel, I think, is the Hebrew for it. And then at the evening, Ben Harbaim, the time you would say the evening prayers, the father prays and praises the creator Abraham. So here is that reclaiming of the tradition, but doing so with the mission of working. And you see that the holy work itself is not the prayer service, it's the labor to build the country. So here you get a flavor for labor Zionism. Today, if you were looking for labor Zionism, there's sort of an ethos in Israel, certainly among the secular populace, of a general socialist orientation. The National Health Service and things like that are part of that. The sense of collective obligation to the state, whether it's serving in the army or other kinds of volunteer work. There is a labor party. It's a shadow of what it used to be for a variety of reasons. And there are still kibbutzim out there that are part of the Israeli economy and society. So we have political Zionism and labor Zionism. The third group is called Revisionist Zionism. Now, Revisionist Zionism was a response against the Labor Party because there were some people who were not quite as socialist. They were more capitalist-oriented, more free enterprise focused, and they also were less sort of idealistic about the working classes all cooperating together. They were a lot more suspicious of outside powers and non-Jewish populations. They were maximalists when it came to territory. They felt they needed as much territory as possible for the Jews and to be as willing to fight back as hard and sometimes as brutally as possible against both the other peoples that shared the land with them, but also the occupying powers. And so there was a whole strain of right-wing revisionist right-wing revisionist Zionist activism that crossed the line into what today we might call terrorism, although they called it freedom fighting. You know, that's the old dualism there. Today's heir to the revisionist party is what is called Likud. And the Likud party historically was secular. Jabotinsky, the founding thinker of revisionism, was secular. Benjamin Netanyahu, believe it or not, is pretty secular. You very rarely see him wear a kippah, a yarmulke, unless he's going to religious events. But on his own, he's not wearing it every day. He's not particularly religious. Now, the other big challenge for Likud is that historically they were very pro-democracy. Part of their point was that you could have a Jewish democracy as long as you had a Jewish majority, which they would zealously want to impose. But they were committed to democratic values, free elections, civil rights, and civil liberties, and so on. And that's in part because when the Labor Party was in charge for a long time, the Likud party was needed to focus on civil rights and democracy because they were advocating for themselves as the minority. So that was very much a part of their political DNA. Now, in the last 15 years or so, with Netanyahu pulling out every stop to stay in power, and the more recent issues around the proposed legal reforms and legal system reforms, judicial appointment reforms, and so on, there's been a lot of concern about how pro-democracy the Likud party is anymore. That's been a real change in that party. A fourth group of Zionists, if three isn't enough, there's more. A fourth group of Zionists are what are called religious Zionists. Remember, the political Zionists, like Herzl never had a bar mitzvah. He was largely secular. The labor Zionists were militantly secular, and the revisionist Zionists were sort of a bourgeois secular. The religious Zionists were those who were very attached to traditional Jewish religion, orthodoxy we would call it today, but they saw the unique benefits of a religious life lived in Israel. There are certain halachot, certain religious laws that can only be practiced, observed in the land of Israel, like leaving land fallow in the seventh year. You don't do that when you're outside of Israel, but you do that there, so that would be an opportunity. Or a society that has an abundance of kosher restaurants. It has a chief rabbinate to enforce Orthodox religious identity questions. I mean, there's all kinds of advantages to having a religious state, or at least having a state that endorses Jewish religion as opposed to living as a minority as they do everywhere else. The religious Zionists also had to come up with a resolution for why they were working with these secular heretics that were the rest of the Zionist movement. And their resolution to that was, well, the secular Zionists may not know it, but they're actually part of the divine plan. So we're also not waiting for a Messiah. We're going to go. And there were religious Jews in Europe who thought it was chutzpah to move. They were opposed to the religious Zionists too, because they weren't waiting for the Messiah. The Messiah was the only viable Zionism for the ultra-Orthodox establishment. And there are still ultra-Orthodox Jews today who don't see the modern state of Israel as a viable entity. But the religious Zionists tried to harmonize the two. They said, if we do build a state, it's the secular Zionists working on behalf of the divine plan they don't even admit is there. But it was still seen as acceptable. Now, the religious Zionist community transformed after 1967, especially with the conquest of not only Gaza, but especially the West Bank, the old heartland of Judea. Remember the Judeans coming from Judea? Well, the old heartland of Judea was wound up in what is known as the West Bank of the River Jordan, and that's why the settlers call it Judea and Samaria. They don't call it the West Bank because their point of reference is the ancient roots of the Jewish people in that territory. But it really transformed their sense of ideology and their relationship to secular Zionists. So there's a nice summary in Troy's book of how this transformation took place. The Six-Day War repurposed religious Zionism. Pre-state religious Zionists, epitomized by the elder Rav Abraham Isaac Kook, loved secular pioneers, seeing beyond their rebellion into their Jewish souls. By contrast, post-1967 religious Zionists, epitomized by the younger Rav Zvi Yehuda Kook, loved the biblical land so much they prioritized settling the newly conquered land over uniting the people. Resulting movements such as Gush Emunim, the Block of the Faithful, seeking to reestablish Jewish settlements in the ancient Jewish heartland, despite Palestinian resistance and global opposition, radicalized much of national religious society. Once fanciful spiritual fantasies now spawned militant plans. This mobilization also mainstreamed religious nationalists professionally and politically. The once quiescent community became more central, powerful, and prosperous in Israel sociologically and ideologically. So if you think about Itamar Ben-Gvir or Bezalel Smotrich and their parties, those are the right-wing religious Zionist settler parties who want a maximalist state, who do not recognize any Palestinian claims on the land, and who are more and more militant in enforcing their ideology. I saw there's a question asking about Samaria. There were two ancient Jewish kingdoms. Yehuda, or Judea, was in the south. Shomron, Samaria, was in the north. Samaria was destroyed by the Assyrians around 722 BCE, and Judea destroyed by the Babylonians about 150 years later, maybe 586 BCE. So they're claiming these ancient biblical names for the territories, basically. Judea was closer to Jerusalem, Samaria further north. More like, if you think of Nablus, which is the modern Palestinian city today, that's more or less where Samaria was. But even by using those names, of course, they're staking their religious claim to the land. There were also cultural Zionists. There's a cultural Zionism. Cultural Zionism focuses on Israeli or Hebrew language cultural identity and their creativity much more than the political state. So you had cultural Zionists like Achad Ha'am, who were focused on Jewish youth groups and Hebrew music and modern Hebrew literature and poetry and all of these pieces that make up a national culture that you can participate in, not in the land, right? You can feel connected to a national culture even in a dispersion. And cultural Zionists are also focused on what does living in this territory, what does speaking this language, what does creating this new national culture do to my sense of Jewishness? So they're focused on identity as much as politics. Obviously, there's some bleed over here. Some of the cultural creators also take political stands. You know, Amos Oz was a famous Israeli author, wrote beautiful novels and short stories. He was also a left-wing political activist, part of that labor Zionist perspective. And then finally, the sixth strain of Zionism that Troy describes is what he calls diaspora Zionism. There have always been Jews since the beginning of the modern Zionist movement who are fully supportive of the initiative to build a Jewish state in the land of Israel, to get it recognized, to have it established, to then support its growth and flourishing. And their connection to Israel is a very important part of their diaspora identity, even if they have no intention whatsoever of moving there. You see, their Zionism is their connection to the state and its idea and the function that plays in their own Jewish identity. So lobbying Congress to support Israel for them is a Jewish activity, right? Not just praying in the synagogue. Marching for Israel, raising money, advocating in the public square and social media and so on. All of this feels like a positive Jewish mission for people to act out their identity, even if they're never moving there. Think about this huge push for diaspora Jews to plant trees in Israel, right? Donate money in your little pushka box, buy a tree, endow a forest. You know, there's always the jokes about people traveling, looking to find their tree inside the forest, which of course it isn't done that way. The reality is that that sense of rootedness, remember the Zionist mission of rootedness, can be accomplished even with scare quotes around it. When you plant a tree, you're being rooted in this place, even if you're not moving there yourself. So that's the idea of a diaspora Zionism, and that's why so many Jews outside of the land of Israel see the support for Israel and the flourishing of Israel as crucial to their Jewish identity. That's why you have an Israeli flag next to an American flag in many synagogues. That's why many American Jews react to anti-Zionist messaging as anti-Semitic, because their Zionism and their Judaism are inseparable. So we're going to take a look at a document that really is sort of a collection of all of these ideologies. It's the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel. This was done as a collective process with all the different factions that were represented in the World Zionist Congress. There weren't enough women, there weren't enough non-Ashkenazi Jews, but there was a wide range of ideological perspectives that were a part of this document. Christian Zionism is not included in this particular book because he's only focused on Jews who are Zionists, not Christians who are. He also didn't include anti-Zionists because his approach was you don't include a book of you don't include writings of homophobes in an LGBTQ anthology, right? They are the anti-people. They can have their own damn anthology. That's sort of the sense of it. So Christian Zionism was beyond the scope of this particular book, and also beyond my focus, because I'm thinking about Zionism as a Jewish phenomenon. There is this odd circumstance now of non-Jews whose religious mission is fulfilled by Jews moving to Israel, but the sense of that is really, it's still a Christian mission, because they see the Jews returning to Israel as a prerequisite for Jesus returning to reestablish the kingdom of Christianity in the world. So it's not particularly altruistic on their part. If you ask Israelis what they think about that, they say, well, we'll take their support now and we'll deal with the other thing if it happens. The Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel, which is really a fascinating document for what it says and also what it does not say. Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, or Palestine, was the birthplace of the Jewish people. Here their spiritual, religious, and political identity was shaped. Here they first attained to statehood, created cultural values of national and universal significance, and gave to the world the eternal book of books. After being forcibly exiled from their land, the people kept faith with it throughout their dispersion and never ceased to pray and hope for their return to it and for the restoration in it of their political freedom. Impelled by this historic and traditional attachment, Jews strove in every successive generation to reestablish themselves in their ancient homeland. In recent decades, they returned in their masses. Pioneers, ma'apilim, immigrants sneaking in, and defenders, they made deserts bloom, revived the Hebrew language, built villages and towns, and created a thriving community, controlling its own economy and culture, loving peace but knowing how to defend itself, bringing the blessings of progress to all the country's inhabitants, and aspiring toward independent nationhood. So this first part is the backstory. This is, why are we justified in declaring a state today? And so some of the arguments they're making are, this is our birthplace. This is where the Jewish people started. Here's where our identity took shape. Here was our first state, our first political entity. And when we were there, look what we did. We wrote the Bible. Just imagine what we can do today. Notice, by the way, that they don't say that God gave the Bible. They say that the Jewish people gave the world the Bible. Now, whether they wrote it or not, that you could see it's sort of ambiguous on that point. But you could certainly read this from a secular perspective and say, These were the creations of the Jewish people. They were not simply the loudspeaker for a divine voice. It claims that they always wanted to return to this land. We talked about some of those sources before. In recent generations, they've earned the right to have a land because they've come back in great numbers. And look what they did. They worked the land, so they've earned it by labor. They fought for the land, they've earned it by blood. They revived their own national language. They've created the basic building block of a national identity, which is a common language. They've created their own settlements, villages and towns. They have their own economy. They have their own culture. They fought to defend it, even if they love peace. And they did right by the natives. Now that phrase, bringing the blessings of progress to all the country's inhabitants, sounds like Jewish white man's burden, the colonialist burden of helping the benighted natives advance. Well, it's problematic phrasing from our post-colonial perspective. But from their perspective, they were doing good by the people of the land by bringing them modern roads, medicine, literacy, and so on. This right of the Jewish people to have their own land was recognized in the Balfour Declaration of 1917, reaffirmed by the mandate of the League of Nations, which gave international sanction to the historic connection between the Jewish people and Eretz Yisrael and the right of the Jewish people to rebuild its national home. So here you have the political Zionists. We got our international recognition from the Balfour Declaration and the League of Nations, and as we'll see, the United Nations post-World War II. It does reference the fact that the disaster that befell the Jewish people, the massacre of millions of Jews in Europe, demonstrated the urgency of solving this problem by reestablishing a state which would be a fully privileged member of the comity of nations, will be a normal people like all other peoples. And notice it's conferring not just to the citizens of Israel, it will confer to the Jewish people everywhere, to every Jew, the normal status of being a fully privileged member of the body of nations. They also highlight in the bottom paragraph here, in the Second World War, the Jewish community contributed its full share to the struggle for freedom and fought against the Nazis. The Palestinian population was much more supportive of Germany, by the way. You can read more about that on your own. So in 1947, in November, the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution calling for the establishment of a Jewish state in Israel. This recognition by the United Nations of the right of the Jewish people to establish their state is irrevocable. The natural right of the Jewish people to be masters of their own fate like all other nations. So there's that core ideology, right? That the Jewish people are a people and all peoples have the right to be masters of their own fate in their own sovereign state. That's the basic claim. Therefore, they establish and declare the state in effect. The state of Israel, I have ellipsed out some clauses here, will be open to Jewish immigration and for the ingathering of the exiles. It will foster the development of the country for the benefit of all its inhabitants. It will be based on freedom, justice, and peace as envisaged by the prophets of Israel. It will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. It will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture, safeguard the holy places of all religions. It will be faithful to the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. Now, you'll notice it doesn't say it will be a democracy. Now, there are other clauses that talk about setting up elections and writing a constitution. And so there's sort of an implication of democracy, but it's not explicit here. But notice some of the guarantees it has. Freedom, justice, and peace. Complete equality of social and political rights, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. No need for an ERA. It's already here in their Declaration of Independence. Guaranteeing freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture. Sounds great. One of the debates is whether Israel has lived up to that Declaration of Independence. Of course, America has also not always lived up to its founding documents. All people are created equal, even though it said all men are created equal, right? They appeal to the Arab inhabitants of the state of Israel to preserve peace and participate in building the state on the basis of full and equal citizenship and due representation in all of its provisional and permanent institutions. So Arab citizens of Israel have always been citizens. They've had limits on their rights. They haven't always had equal treatment, but they've always had citizenship and representation in government. We appeal to the Jewish people throughout the diaspora to rally around the Jews of Eretz Yisrael in the task of immigration and upbuilding, and stand by them in the great struggle for the realization of the age-old dream, the redemption of Israel. So here you get the diaspora Zionism flavor to it, right? That even if you're not going to move here, support us from where you are. And then the last passage, placing our trust in the rock of Israel, we affix our signatures on this provision of at the proclamation of this session of the Provisional Council of State. Now, that rock of Israel was actually a compromise phrase because the religious party wanted to acknowledge God. And the socialists and communists said, over our dead bodies, are you going to do anything that says anything about God in this document? So they came up with that phrase, the rock of Israel, as a euphemism for God, but it's neutral enough, or you could just be talking about the rock that is Israel. So you could secularize it if you need to. And so that was one example of sort of bridge building in that early state period among the different Zionist ideologies. Now, that document, as an expression of Zionist ideology, is very different than the kind of Zionism is racism and Zionism is colonialism and it's very different from what you hear, in the college campus protest or the social media pile-on. Now, there are aspects of that document that could lend itself to that kind of a reading, like that treatment of the, bringing the blessings of progress to all the inhabitants and some of that language. So it's not innocent of those issues. But Zionism itself has always had particular challenges for us to understand, given our non-ethnic democracy experience in the United States, but also as it relates to the current of Western European thought. One challenge is the fact that Zionism, at its root, is a collective identity. It says that your identity is based on your collective. It's your ethnic nation. You have certain rights based on being this ethnic national, including a right of return if you're Jewish living outside the state. You have certain obligations as part of this collective identity, whether it's mandatory military service or advocating on behalf of the state, even if you don't live there. Your identity is part of this collective identity. You have to have a religious marker on your personal identity card. It could be non-religious. That's a recent category that was innovated, but generally you had to be one or the other. You couldn't be just a citizen. In fact, even your citizenship is based on your collective identity because Jews have a right of return to the Jewish state, which, by the way, is not unique in the world. If you look up other countries, there's lots of rights of return for ethnic nationals living outside of the political boundaries of a state for many countries in the world. It's not only in Israel. But what this does is it presents a kind of rebuttal to the Enlightenment, where the Enlightenment said, you're an individual, you're a rational person, you are part of the universal culture of human heart and intellect. The response to the Enlightenment in the 19th century, the first half of the 19th century, was something called the Romantic movement, which said, no, we're not just rational beings living in a bubble. We are people rooted in a land, in a culture, in emotional attachments. And so Zionism is an emotional attachment to Jewish peoplehood in a broad sense. It's not simply the pure individual who is evaluating which group do I want to join today. Do I want to watch this channel or watch that channel? Do I want to do this activity or that activity? At a certain point, you're part of a group, and you have group allegiance, group identity, group activity, and group connections. And that rubs some people the wrong way, as we'll see in the anti-Zionism discussion next week. A second challenge that Zionism has run into is that we really have a lack of historical Jewish experience in exercising government. Remember, we haven't had an independent state. Before 1948, we had not had an independent state since 135 BCE, in the end of the Bar Kokhba revolt. So from 135 to 1948 is 1,800 years not having political sovereignty. We aren't used to it. We don't know how to deploy military power in the same way that other countries who've been around for a long time. Maybe that's good. We could do it differently. but having the rule of law that we can enforce with jails and even capital punishment or corporal punishment, or Jewish law did have a whole history, but it was running sort of on the margins of the main court system and had limited enforcement powers. It was as much, communal collective enforcement by reputation and by maybe fining and things like that, but it was run more on reputation and on reliance than it was on legal monopoly of force, to use Max Weber's concept of government as the monopoly of force. Now Jews have the monopoly of force in a Jewish state. And are they going to decide by Jewish law or by secular law or by the laws their parliament passes or by something else? We don't have a lot of Jewish experience with democracy. I mean, democracy isn't that old anyways, but Jews have even less experience with it. Many of the Jews coming to the land of Israel came from the Middle East, from countries like Iraq, Algeria. They weren't used to having full rights in a democracy in the same way that Jews coming from European countries sometimes were, certainly Jews coming from America. And so the concept of the universal democratic allegiance to the state as opposed to your particular subgroup, that's sometimes a foreign phenomenon there. Although, frankly, in America, with our history of ethnic groups and their block voting, we could also learn a few things. And they have very little experience. The Jews have very little experience in separating religion and politics, because historically we've always had the two intertwined. Jewish communal government in Eastern Europe was called the Kehillah. It was run by the rabbi and the rich people, and the rich people married their kids to the rabbi. So there was always overlap between the community, between the leadership, and there was no separation between religion and politics or governance. So we're still getting the hang of that too. Now, a third challenge that Zionism has run into is the paradoxical commitment to be a Jewish and a democratic state. As I said, democracy doesn't appear in the Declaration of Independence, even though it's sort of implied, but in basic laws that were passed by the Parliament, Knesset, in 1985 and 1992, they explicitly use that phrase, Jewish and democratic. And the Israel Democracy Institute, which is a non-governmental organization, tried to flesh out what's meant by those two terms. So I found their summary to be useful, so I want to share with you their summary of what they mean by Jewish and democratic. The state of Israel is a Jewish state in the following two senses. It is the political framework in which the right of the Jewish people to self-determination is manifested, and it is a Jewish nation state. A first and necessary condition to being a Jewish and democratic state is the decisive majority of Jews in the state. It's a Jewish state, it should be majority Jewish, and a decisive majority, not 51.2%. Israel's attribute as a Jewish and democratic state is conveyed through aspects of Zionism and Jewish heritage. First and foremost, each and every Jew has the right to immigrate to the state. Other aspects are Hebrew being the official language of the state and the inextricable link to Jewish culture and public life. You know, when you go there during Hanukkah time, it's menorahs on the street posts, not Christmas trees or Santa Claus. And on the other hand, the characterization of the state as Jewish is not intended to bestow extra privileges on its Jewish citizens and does not obligate the imposition of religious requirements by state law. The Israeli flag has a Jewish star on it. That's the national symbol. On the second hand, the state of Israel is democratic in the following sense. The sovereign is the entire community of the nation's citizens, and it alone, irrespective of ethnic national origin. In the main, the character of the state as a democratic country is manifested by two basic principles: the recognition of the dignity of man qua man, or person qua person, and the second is the recognition of the values of equality and tolerance. Arrangements regarding free and equal elections, the recognition of core human rights, including dignity and equality, separation of powers, the rule of law, and independent judiciary are drawn from these principles. Democracy's basic principles require equal treatment of all those included as citizens of the state without regard to their ethnic, religious, cultural, or linguistic affiliations. This is very well worded, but it doesn't resolve the paradox, where if you have an automatic right of immigration to the state, that's different than someone who wants a family reunification and has to go through a long process to do that because they don't happen to have Jewish family. The national symbol is a Jewish star. The national anthem is in Hebrew and only in Hebrew and speaks of a Jewish heart. And for the 20% of the population that's Arab, that doesn't speak to them. So to have a national anthem that doesn't speak to your particular group's experience would feel alienating. Now, is that enough to call it non-democratic? Well, you can call it less than perfectly democratic, maybe. If you consider democracy a scale of 1 to 100, some of these aspects are demerits in the democracy score, but other aspects like a relatively free press, rule of law, independent judiciary, regular elections, those maybe are pluses. Of course, we can't talk about the challenge of Zionism without talking about competing claims for the same land with the Palestinians. One of the early slogans attributed to the Zionist movement, very, very poorly thought out, was Zionism is people without a land for a land without people. But there were people there. It wasn't a land without people. They just weren't, recognized as people. And then the last piece that we have to deal with Zionism, and is sort of previewing the anti-Zionism conversation next time, is that Zionism is sometimes thought of and accused of being today a kind of European colonialism. The theory is that the Zionist movement was simply a bunch of Europeans who showed up with their whiteness and imposed it on the dark people who live in the land, people of color there, and it's a classic model of European colonialism. Except it's not. Because, first of all, it's a claim of moving to a homeland and have no other homeland to go back to. The French in Algeria always knew they were French. And when the Algerians revolted, they went back to France. But the Jews who are there, most of them have no place to go back to. The Jews from Europe who came as Holocaust survivors, they're not going back. The Jews from the Middle Eastern countries, from Iran, from Iraq, from Morocco, they're not going back. In fact, the majority of Jews in Israel are not European. They're from the Ottoman Empire, Turkey, Southern Balkans, yes, is European, but North Africa and Central Asia and the Middle East are not Europeans. And, for a European colony to have 20% of its citizens be Arabs and Palestinians in the 1949 armistice boundaries, aka the Green Line, that makes a difference in terms of your colonial accusations. So we'll talk more about this colonialism question next time when we look at what is anti-Zionism. But I hope you got out of this exploration of what is Zionism a sense that there is no one version of Zionism that is correct, accurate, universally accepted. And the core approach to Zionism is the idea that it's part of Jewish identity. It transforms Jewish identity in sometimes good ways and sometimes challenging ways. And it has resulted in a great success of establishing a Jewish state from nothing. That was its major achievement in the 20th century. What remains to be seen in the 21st century is whether those idealistic messages of reforming the Jews, of reforming Jewish identity, of living in peace with its neighbors, going back to those principles of the Declaration of Independence, can those fully be realized? If we are optimistic and hopeful, we might take the same approach that Barack Obama spoke about when thinking about the promise of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution in the United States, where he said it was working toward a still more perfect union, that we can do better. We started out poorly, we've gotten better, and we can do still better. That would be the ideal of the liberal in Israel, who would look back to that Declaration of Independence and say, this was our vision. They were not prophets, they were people, but people have ideals, and people can work to make those ideals real, and that's our mission. The Zionism now is an internal Zionism to hit the promised land of our vision, not just the political entity of an independent state. So, any particular comments, questions, reactions to any of that? I know it's a lot of material in a short time, but hopefully some of this was news, or at least new understandings of something you've been familiar with for a while. Well, we've gone from Abraham to Zionism all the way through. Next week, as I said, we'll be talking about anti-Zionism. and what that's all about. We will see how that turns out. I see a question here in the box. It doesn't seem possible to maintain a majority of Jews by exclusively democratic means. Well, that's an interesting question, because we don't think of democracy as privileging a particular ethnic group in America, right? But it did for a long time. You know, before the immigration reforms of 1964, or I think it was 64, 65, the immigration laws in America privileged Northern white Europeans. So they picked a date, I think 1882 or 1883, and they said the immigration quotas are set by the proportion of the population of these particular groups based on that time. And so it privileged white Northern Europeans. So for quite a long period of time, from the 1920s to the 1960s, America privileged immigration by particular groups and discouraged it from other groups. Were we not a democracy then? Well, we were, but we were an imperfect one, maybe. Of course, Black Americans, by and large, couldn't vote then either, unless they were in northern states. So it wasn't very democratic for them either. The challenge for Israel is, if they want to be a majority Jewish state, how do they achieve that? They can achieve that by immigration. So getting the Russian Jews to come in the 1990s was very helpful. Certainly after the state was founded, the numbers transformed the population of the country radically. I actually have statistics for that handy here as it works out. Just give me a second. Okay, so if you look at this chart here, here's the population in 1941, before the state's founded. You've got 474,000 Jews, 1.1 million Arabs, a total of 1.6 million. By 1967, after the founding of the state, the expulsion of a number of Palestinians, and also Palestinians simply fleeing as refugees and not allowed to return. It wasn't all expulsion. And you have the great expulsion of Middle Eastern Jews from North Africa and from Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, other Middle Eastern countries, and numbers leaving Europe as well. You see the numbers here. Now, the Jewish population is 2.4 million, and the Arab population in Israel is 393,000. So that's about, again, 80-20. And if you just keep those numbers and have a similar birth rate between the communities, you can maintain a substantially Jewish population that runs democratically. The challenge is these territories, because you notice the Arab population in the occupied territories, which for when this chart was made included both Gaza and the West Bank or Judea Samaria. That's where you'll notice the population numbers now are getting a lot closer, where the total Jewish population is here it has 4.9 million. The Arab population, including the territories, is 5.1 million. So you can see it's pretty close to even, if not majority Arab, if you count all the population in Gaza and the West Bank. So if Israel wants to be its largest size, then it can't be democratic if it wants to be Jewish. You can't give all the West Bank Palestinians and all the Gaza Palestinians a vote in the state and have it still be a Jewish state. So you can be Jewish but not democratic and big. Or you could be a smaller state and Jewish and democratic. You give up the West Bank, you withdraw from Gaza, you create a Palestinian state where most of the Palestinians are citizens there, and then you can have your 80-20, right? Maybe you do some land adjustments around the side to cover the main settlement blocks in East Jerusalem. You work on some kind of land swaps with the Negev, and you make it work. That could be a Jewish and democratic state, but not big. It has to be smaller. Or you can be a democratic state and big, but not Jewish. Because if you have the maximal state and give everyone the vote, then it's close to 50-50 between the populations. And now you've got to ask, what should the flag look like? And what should the national language be? And what's our defense policy? And what do we do with these settlements? And what do we do with these access roads? And what do we do with immigration laws? And now it becomes not a Jewish state anymore. So in the end, Israel has to pick 2 out of 3. It can be Jewish and democratic, but small. It can be Jewish and big, but not democratic. Or it can be democratic and big, but not Jewish. And different parties are going to have different answers to that question.